came back in thinking that my stream was still going, and it so wasn't. But we've got some good news because apparently there is going to be soon a deal announced. So that is wonderful news. But we are probably not going to be bombing Iran. But let's see what we can actually find out here. I was gonna do this so that we couldn't even see all that, but hey, you've got my kitty cat in the background, so there's this cat tree. So let's just do this. I think the easiest thing for us to do here is going to be let's see what we can find out as far as deals go. Now this right here is kind of funny. Senior shall say the country is prepared for both peace and war with a stark warning that the situation reached a pivotal moment with potential far-reaching consequences. See, that was 13 minutes ago, but I'm hearing that they've made some progress here. Let's go to Fate Tech News. Fate Tech News was supposedly reporting it. An Iranian source tells Al-Arabi Al-Jadid that Iran is leaning toward accepting a 2-week ceasefire out of respect for the Pakistani mediator in order to give diplomacy an additional chance. The regional source said some good news is expected from both sides soon, and the discussions were steered directly by Pakistani's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir. Let's go to CNN and see what CNN has to say. Oh, and here's some other things. Kidnapped American journalist released by pro-Iran militia in Iraq. That is some very good news. That is some very good news. The White House says the president is aware of Pakistan's proposal for a two-week ceasefire and notes a response will come. Ceasefire request. President Donald Trump has been made aware of a ceasefire that allows for diplomatic between the U.S. and Iran, and a response will come. But see, this is not... This really isn't, to me, making it sound like they are for sure accepting it. I've got to fix some things because my thing dying means my computer's going hooey. Not all my sound was connected. Limiting deadline. Trump predicts that a whole civilization will die tonight as he goes an 8 p.m. deadline. Key line is that the U.S. military turns on an IRS strategic Card Island, from which almost all of the country's oil is extorted, or to U.S. officials, but did not hit oil facilities. See, that is actually making it sound... This makes it sound a little more iffy. The good news is expected soon, source says, after Pakistan asked Trump to extend Iran deadline. Pakistan Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif has asked warring parties to observe a two-week ceasefire to allow diplomacy to achieve a conclusive termination of war in a post on X. He also asked U.S. President Donald Trump to extend his deadline on Iran by 2 weeks and for Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz during the 2-week period. Regional sources said good news is expected from both sides soon, that the discussions were steered but directly by Pakistan's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir. The source added that the deal is expected to be closed tonight. The White House said Tuesday Trump had been made aware of Sharif's proposal ceasefire and the response will come. He had said that he talked about U.S. being in heated negotiations. Pakistan, along with Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, have been acting as a mediator between the warring countries. Diplomatic efforts for peaceful settlement on the ongoing war in the Middle East are progressing steadily, strongly, and powerfully, with the potential to lead to substantial results in the near future. I mean, this was sounding like it was gonna be good news, but he says response is incoming. That doesn't sound promising to me. That does not sound promising to me at all. Looking at some things here. I'm supposed, and maybe it is. Wow. It's so hard to predict what that means. But I'm hoping it means we are indeed going to have a ceasefire of some kind. We got some updates too about the Nancy Guthrie disappearance that I just think is interesting and worth noting. This is from Brian Hinton. There was some more
for the Nancy Guthrie mystery. It is now day 66 since Nancy Guthrie literally just vanished out of her home outside Tucson, Arizona. I'm going to focus in this episode on what I have learned about.
Good grief. There was the sound.
I'm also going to go back and talk to you about some of the previous ransom notes from early on and why it seems Savannah Guthrie believes that 2 of those ransom notes from early on are in fact. Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out my show. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate all of your support. Please click to subscribe. I am, of course, continuing to cover the Nancy Guthrie mystery. It is now day 66 since Nancy Guthrie literally just vanished out of her home outside Tucson, Arizona. I'm going to focus in this episode on what I have learned about the ransom notes, and not only the new ransom notes that I told you about yesterday that came to TMZ, and there are actually 2 of them. There's one that came in the morning yesterday, and there was another one that came in the afternoon, and they are apparently from the same person. But I'm also going to go back and talk to you about some of the previous ransom notes from early on and why it seems Savannah Guthrie believes that 2 of those ransom notes from early on are in fact perhaps are real. But first, let me get to the latest on these TMZ ransom notes, and there are some new details that I learned today that I didn't know about yesterday when we first learned that these new ransom notes or alleged ransom notes came to TMZ. So TMZ says that they have gotten more than 6 emails from this same person who sent these notes yesterday, emails in the past claiming to have information about Nancy Guthrie. The person claims to know who the kidnappers are, and something I want to point out is Harvey Levin, when he was talking about the notes, and he's obviously seen the notes for himself, he says that the person used kidnappers plural. So there's more than one kidnapper, according to whoever is writing these notes. They claim to know where Nancy Guthrie is. And Harvey Levin said that they had not gotten a note in a month from this person, but then again got 2 notes yesterday, one in the morning and one that came yesterday in the afternoon. That would, of course, be Los Angeles time. TMZ is based in LA. The note said that Nancy Guthrie is in Sonora, Mexico, and that she is not alive. Sonora, Mexico, of course, is the area right on the other side of the border from where Tucson, Arizona is. Tucson, Arizona, so it's very close to Mexico, obviously. The note reportedly said, quote, "I saw her alive with them in the state of Sonora, Mexico." And again, it's interesting that it says with them, indicating that if this is true, the kidnappers would be plural, more than one kidnapper. This person says that they can lead authorities to the kidnapper. And according to Harvey Levin, the person who wrote this email has said these same things before, that they can lead authorities to the kidnapper, and is basically repeating a lot of what he said early on when these other notes were sent to TMZ. So TMZ also confirmed that no money has been deposited into the Bitcoin account. Remember that this person sending these notes is also including a Bitcoin account and demanding about the value of half of the Bitcoin, which is somewhere around like in the $30,000 range, a little more than that. But as of last night, there was no money that had been deposited into the Bitcoin account. Harvey Levin says that he has talked to the FBI, that they've been giving them all this information, and he says that his spidey senses are telling him something about this guy, that there's something significant that makes Harvey Levin think that this could be legit, although he seems to insinuate that the FBI is not really taking any of this that seriously. According to Levin, the person who wrote these notes said the person who wrote these notes that came yesterday also wrote a note the Tuesday after Nancy Guthrie was kidnapped and said that he knew where Guthrie was and who the kidnappers are. So that was the Tuesday after Nancy Guthrie was kidnapped. Then wrote another note on the Wednesday after Nancy Guthrie was kidnapped. So this was months ago, saying that time is no longer of the essence. So Harvey Levin is trying to make the point that whoever did this seems to be claiming that when he wrote the first notes, Nancy Guthrie was alive, and then wrote a second note on Wednesday, and Nancy Guthrie was no longer alive. Levin says if someone is carrying out a hoax, why take the immediacy away? And that is the reason that Levin is trying to say that these notes could perhaps be real. Because if you just made the whole thing up and you wanted more money, why wouldn't you still claim that Nancy Guthrie was alive and be trying to get more money? Whereas instead, this person reportedly seemed to be insinuating that Nancy Guthrie was alive initially and then changed the message the next day saying that there was no longer an immediacy. Levin says that the FBI is not convinced enough to tell anyone to pay the money, which would explain why the Bitcoin account is still empty. It's interesting when you think about it. I mean, it's not, in the world of Savannah Guthrie, it's not that much money, $30,000, a little more than that. So you wonder, in a sense, like, why not just pay the money to wait and see? But if you've got the FBI saying not to pay it, you have to sort of take that into account. And again, Harvey Levin is saying that the Bitcoin account is still empty, at least as of last night. So I want to point out these notes are different than the notes that came initially to the local TV stations in Tucson, and those also went to TMZ. The reason they are different is because this person is not claiming to be the kidnapper. This person is just claiming to have information about where Nancy is and who the kidnappers are. Those other notes appear to actually be from an alleged kidnapper, and those other notes seem to be the notes that Savannah Guthrie believes could be real. It's interesting, Harvey Levin is saying that the FBI told him that they believe that those notes are real, those two that I'm talking about, not the ones from this person, but the other two where they claim to actually be the kidnapper. And Harvey Levin is saying that the FBI believes those two are real, which would go along with what Savannah Guthrie said in that interview with Hoda. Remember, she said she tends to believe that two of the notes are real too. So that she's probably getting that information from the FBI. That would make sense. And remember, at least with the local TV station, I found out that those two notes that Savannah tends to believe are real, and according to Harvey Levin, the FBI also believes are real, were not just emailed to the local TV station in Tucson. They were sent in through a form. Like, when you go to a website and you actually fill out a form and then you click submit. That's the way that it was done, I am told, which could be part of the reason that the FBI has had a hard time tracing back who these people are. At the same time, it is kind of shocking that it's been 66 days and that with all of the technology of the FBI, they don't have a way to figure out who sent those messages to the local TV station that they tend to believe are real, and who's sending these messages to TMZ, which it seems to be a different person. So I am surprised that the FBI still hasn't been able to figure that out with all the technology they have, but apparently whoever did this had a really good way of staying secret. So Levin says that they were working with the FBI, that the FBI was working with their TMZ team trying to figure out who has sent these notes, and that they came up dry, that they still haven't been able to determine it. TMZ also said the ransom letters they received threatened to kill Nancy, which is something new. And I go back, those would have been the letters, those two letters that came early on that Savannah believes are real. It seems those are the ones he's talking about when he says that whoever wrote those letters threatened to kill Nancy. So I know it's kind of a lot to keep track of. There's a lot of different letters that have floated around, but it is interesting to think about these two letters. It wasn't just one, it was one yesterday morning and one in the afternoon yesterday that were sent to TMZ. And is timing just a coincidence? They were sent the same day that Savannah Guthrie went back to the Today Show. I'm joined now by Brian Martin, who is a detective with the Fort Wayne Police Department, who also specializes in cold cases. Brian, it's nice to see you. Thank you for having this chat with me. It's also nice I know you're an active detective right now, which is Awesome to talk to you. The first thing I want to ask you is there's been all these new developments with these ransom notes that came to TMZ. We've now learned two that came yesterday. So today's Tuesday. These came on Monday, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And Harvey Levin, who runs TMZ, seems to think like there may be some legitimacy to these. And they come the
Okay.
same day that Savannah Guthrie went back to the Today Show. What do you think? What did your gut tell you?
So so there's two schools of thought obviously on this. One is it's somebody just out there being just nasty and seeking attention and trying to cause the family heartache. And then obviously the other school of thought would be that you have a legitimate ransom note and you have somebody who is involved in the case, the perpetrator, or somehow working with the perpetrator and sending these notes. And
Oh,
I find it a
that.
little bit odd that they waited so long to start sending ransom
Remember
notes.
because it's been
But I
so
can tell
long
you
since
from
I
firsthand
felt
experience
this.
in a case that I've worked in the past,
How do I
we had
change what
ransom
we
notes. We had
have?
some ransom notes that not necessarily ransom notes, but taunting letters.
What this one
And we had that hard
There we
decision
go.
whether we were going to
Yay.
hold that information in or whether we were going to release those letters to the public and try to use the public to assist us with solving the case. Our ultimate decision was that we did release them, but we sat on them for a while and we had them analyzed. We went through them. And then after everything came to light, we actually realized there were some notes that were left that we missed, just because of environmental reasons. Where the notes and letters were left, no one found them, or they were destroyed or thrown away. But I this person, whoever sent the letters, obviously wants
That's
the
weird.
letters.
Why are
They
you in
want
my
some attention.
home?
They want those letters to be
Who are
found, or they wouldn't
you?
have sent them to a
Hey,
news outlet. That's somebody
I
who
gotta go.
wants to be heard.
Bye.
um, I would hope that if it is the
That's an
person
embarrassing.
involved
That's an
in
embarrassing
Miss
fact about
Guthrie's
her.
disappearance, that they
Got
want to be
that
heard
background?
and are legitimately trying to
You need some
negotiate
background.
some type of deal or whatever it is that they're looking to do, and not maybe somebody who has ulterior motives for attention that has nothing to do with the case. And you get somebody like that, and it's going to take this case down a completely wrong path, away from Miss Guthrie, away from trying to solve this case and finding her. If she's still alive, and I hate to say it like that, say if she's still alive, but we're at 2 months, and Miss Guthrie, uh, from my understanding, was not in the best of health. She needed medication. So you have to have some serious concerns for her well-being.
Yeah, and this person, according to TMZ, from the notes yesterday, has written like I think they said half a dozen of notes before throughout this whole 2 months, and is not claiming to be the kidnapper, but is claiming to know who that person is, or actually uses plural, who the people are, and where Nancy Guthrie is, and is asking for half a Bitcoin, which is like somewhere around $34,000, $33,000. And TMZ says they looked in the Bitcoin account; it's empty, so it's a real account. I'm curious, like if you're Savannah Guthrie and you have a lot of money, if you were advising her, what do you think the FBI is saying? Like, should you just take the chance and pay 30 some thousand dollars, which is probably not a lot of money for her, and just see what happens?
I would like to think that the FBI is probably offering her some advice, and that advice is twofold. You're going to go down this path of, okay, today they're asking for half a Bitcoin. Okay, so tomorrow is it going to be another Bitcoin? Is this person actually going to give legitimate information, or are they just trying to soak the family for money?
Hmm.
And you hope that somebody's not doing that. And my big concern with asking for half a Bitcoin, it's my understanding there's a considerable reward for information leading to the recovery of Miss Guthrie. So therefore, why would you not just submit a tip to a legitimate Crime Stoppers, or to the sheriff's department, or to the FBI, or to the tip line that's set up, and get the $100,000, get the $100,000? So that makes it a little suspect to me. I'd be very suspect of this individual who claims to
We,
have information and only
yeah,
wants
these things make me
34,000, or
scared.
roughly,
Very
when
weird.
there's
These don't make any
considerably more on
sense.
the table. That if they truly do know information about the suspect or suspects, um, why would you not do it the right way, and it's going to be a monetary gain for them, as opposed to doing it this kind of secret, kind of cloak and dagger
Mm.
um, kind of information. That makes me suspect. One thing that I do like that you said was the fact that they mentioned suspects, plural. I think that maybe they're just assuming if they really don't have knowledge, but I firmly believe there's more than one person involved in Miss Guthrie's disappearance. She's an older person. She would need assistance or possibly being carried out. So it would lead you to believe that more than one person was involved in her disappearance or kidnapping.
I guess what you said about a slippery slope is a good point. Like if they're asking for half a Bitcoin now, how do you know you don't give them that? And then suddenly they're like, okay, well now if you really want more info, you have to pay a full Bitcoin. Or, I mean that's a good that probably is what the FBI is telling Savannah. But again, when you're that rich, and I don't know. I'm just thinking if it was my mom and I had that kind of money and I'm up at night, it's like, do I just pay the 30? You know what I mean? Like.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure the Guthrie family is very torn because part of it is just like you said. Money's all relative, depending on what you do, how much you have,
Yeah.
and but it draws me to really be concerned with, okay, are we going to start here and this is going to be a continuing ongoing game, or somebody else finds out and this becomes almost one of those scam deals that people get on the telephone. Hey, I need this much in order to do XYZ. And
Mm.
then next thing you know, you got two more people submitting letters, and it's another 30, it's another 50, and they nickel and dime you, and you gain no information. And that's money that could be put forward to a legitimate way of trying to retrieve their mother or their loved one.
So there were these notes I'm talking about from yesterday, and that person who's apparently sent many to TMZ. But then there were other notes early on that went also to the local TV station in Tucson, which those seem to be the notes that Savannah. She said in her interview that she believes that two of the notes are legitimate. Um, so those are different notes from a different sender. And I'm just wondering, are you surprised? I mean, it's been now 66 days that like the FBI hasn't been able to track with all the technology they have, they haven't been able to figure out who's sending these notes.
Okay, so with the notes, I think it's again, it's always twofold, right? You would think that they'd be able to track a note, and you base that off of what we see on television. We base that off of people watching crime shows, and they'll scan this letter, they'll retrieve DNA, they'll retrieve fingerprints. But if somebody sent these letters and took countermeasures, wore protection, latex gloves, whatever they may have done, washed the letters, did whatever, and there's no DNA on those letters and there's no fingerprints, then it'd be very difficult to track a letter that's sent through mail or even email with fake accounts. It'd be extremely difficult to track without that physical evidence being on. Much like you receive, if you or I received a threatening letter in the mail, and if the person did their due diligence and didn't leave fingerprints and didn't leave DNA, you got to ask yourself, how exactly are we going to track this? Yeah, sure. We know where it went to the post office. We know its origin, but that doesn't mean that I didn't drive 100 miles to drop it at a mailbox. That doesn't mean that I didn't hand it off to somebody to drop in a mailbox or some random location. So I think that plays into this. The other thing is, we don't know that the FBI isn't tracking those and isn't running down a suspect and doing their homework and doing surveillance and following up on information with this person. And they're just not announcing it because I personally, if it were my investigation, if I was on to one or two suspects, I wouldn't release that. That'd be cut very close in just with my team, because the last thing we would want to do is send somebody running, spook them, have them go dark on us, have them, us go someplace where we couldn't find them, have them dump their digital footprint, get rid of emails, get rid of cell phones, and then we'd be back to square one with all the investigation trying to track them. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well, that the FBI and local law enforcement in this case isn't going to show their whole hand.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, we have sources close to the investigation who have said that there are no viable suspects right now. You know, that it's there's not a lot going on from what we hear. If you were running this case, do you think they should be using the media differently? I mean, because they've been quiet for quite some time now. I mean, the sheriff has done few interviews here and there because he's come under fire for a lot of things and is trying to defend himself. But the FBI hasn't done any interviews. There hasn't been like a big press conference about the Nancy Guthrie case. Is there anything you would be doing differently in regards to using the media?
I like to use the media when I get to a point in a case where I feel like maybe I'm stumped or I've hit a roadblock or I've started to, it's plateaued, and I'll release bits and pieces of information to elicit the help from
Sounding
the
like
public,
they're.
and I do so by using the media.
Hold on a
Whether
second.
that would be to release one of these original notes or ransom letters, if you will, that they feel was a had some.
We're not really learning anything new here with this, unfortunately. But it does appear that there has been another shooting by ICE. Let's see if I can. Showed up on CNN, but I'm not sure. It's gotta put it behind a stupid paywall. Okay. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents were involved in a shooting that sent one person to the hospital while they were conducting a targeted traffic stop in California's Central Valley. The ICE officers fired defensive shots at the person they stopped, intending to run an agent over. Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons said in a statement shared with CNN by the Department of Homeland Security. The shooting happened near Interstate 5 in Patterson, about 90 miles south of Sacramento. The suspect is identified as Carlos Ivan Mendez Hernandez. He is an undocumented immigrant and an 18th Street gang member. Wanted in El Salvador for questioning in connection to a murder. As officers approached the car, the wanted gang member weaponized his vehicle and attempted to run an officer over. Per training, our officers fired defensive shots to protect themselves, fellow agents, and the public. DHS says agents have been the target of increasing violence, citing more than 180 vehicle attacks. As established practice, we expect our federal law enforcement officers to appropriately collaborate with state and federal law enforcement as this matter is investigated. California Governor Gavin Newsom's office said it. I hung up a thing for my bird feeder for my cat, but I don't think birds are roasting yet. Well, it's sounding like we could have a possible deal. But, you know, it's just one of those things that it's kind of hard to say. We could have a deal, we could not have a deal. They're closer than what they were. But there's a possibility this is going to result in some protests. So that's great. He's a suspected gang member, but he's just a good boy who ain't done nothing wrong. We don't know exactly what is happening. I want to see what the answer is. Cavity as well. Text News. Some news. They. Ceasefire with our. I think CBS News might have an update here. A ceasefire is being negotiated with Iran, Pakistani sources said. A ceasefire with Iran is being negotiated by Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. Vice President J.D. Vance is serving as the U.S. interlocutor in the talks. On a social media post earlier Tuesday, Sharif said Pakistan had put forth a deal that involved 2 weeks ceasefire during which Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, it could fall apart. It could fall apart, but we'll see. You know, it's my just concern that we are always going to have to deal with them being a threat. We just always are. And it's my personal opinion that there's not much you can really do about that. I think it's a biblical thing that they're always going to be a threat. I want to see if there's a game that I'm trying to check out here and see if I want to download it. It looks like it'd be fun. But it's probably really hard too. Excuse me. I'm gonna download a game that I've never done before. Let's see how it goes. And of course, Pelosi, of all people, thinks that she can criticize his instability. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi criticizes Trump on Tuesday over his latest threat against Iran. Donald Trump's inability is more clear and dangerous than ever. If the cabinet is not willing to invoke the 25th Amendment and restore sanity, Republicans must convene Congress to end this war. But, you know, the pain of it is that both chambers of Congress have rejected several resolutions